Richard's there as well.
Superb timing. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, a big warm welcome to the North of England Tourism Business Barometer Roundtable, sponsored by NatWest. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you this morning, and would like to share with you the findings of the Business Barometer that's been conducted fortnightly over the last 16 weeks throughout the North, businesses throughout the North, with our 9 DMOs and their network of tourism, hospitality and leisure businesses. And it's a very, very thorough report. We've muted and taken your cameras off for this morning, but you can use the chat buttons on the right-hand side of your screen, and there will be an opportunity to take a poll at the end. So please use the chat button and I'll pull in questions. We've got Q&A at the end. I'd just like to introduce our speakers for this morning. First of all, we've got Richard Topless, who's the chair of the Northern Regional Board, the NatWest, and he's also chair of the growth company here in Manchester. We've got Philip Bartlett, also from NatWest, who's senior economist, Nick Brook Sykes, director of tourism, Marketing Manchester, Jill Haig, CEO at Cumbria Tourism, and also Chris Brown, director marketing Liverpool, and many of our other colleagues across the DMOs that participated are here with us on the call this morning too. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Richard to kick us off and just give an overview of the NatWest Barometer and why the NatWest kindly sponsored this piece of work.
Well, good morning, Shona, and good morning, everyone. First off, a thank you to you and your team for putting together and doing all the work for the surveys. I guess when the pandemic hit, none of us really knew what to expect, but it became quite clear early on that business operators really noticed that their usual networks had been disrupted, and there was a real thirst for an understanding of what was going on and what trends were being seen, and just what benchmarks really businesses might use to judge their performance and perhaps share best practice. And this was none more so than in the leisure sector. And that's why we decided to work with Marketing Manchester and DMOs across the North to run this survey. And the results over the past weeks have shown the real contrast between different leisure sectors, be they based in towns and cities, which have seen a real slowdown, which continues to this day, and hotels and destinations in more rural areas and national parks where there has been a fluctuations, quite dramatic fluctuations in demand, occupancy, and turnover. As you know, we've seen some real contrast between performance during the help out to eat out, for instance, and where we find ourselves now, and the dreadful impact of this second lockdown, which we are now in. I think the slide you can see, I don't want really to focus on the numbers, but gives you some sort of sense of the financial impact and support that NatWest has put out to the leisure sector across the country. I haven't broken it down to the North, but you could say 20% of that would be to the leisure sector in the North. And you can look at it in two different ways, really. You can say that, it's good that banks and financial services in general have been able to support the leisure sector with, billions of additional debt to keep it going. But at another level, you can see the scale of the additional challenges as the sector grapples with this increase in debt, on top of all the challenges that the sector will face as hopefully we emerge from the pandemic next year. I'm an eternal optimist, and the last thing I wanted to sort of call out and note from the surveys is that, you know, the sector has shown remarkable resilience, and businesses within the sector. It's shown huge creativity and positivity. And I think, you know, those characteristics will ultimately see the sector return to where it was before, which is a key source of employment and wealth generation across the north of England. But for the foreseeable future, there are some huge challenges which lie ahead, which no doubt we'll touch on through Phil's session and indeed when we get on to questions, Shona. So I'll pass back to you. Shona, can you hear me?
Thank you very much, Richard. I did the ultimate sin of not unmuting. You'd think we'd learn by now. A question from Gary Lovett that's come in, Richard, please. Does this data include BBL as well as CBILS?
Some of it, yes.
Okay.
So it's more difficult to drill it down to sectors, is the short answer with BBLs.
Super, thank you. And thanks again for joining us this morning and sponsoring this great piece of work. Okay, so we're going to go now to Nick Brook Sykes, who Nick and his team on the research side engineered the survey along with a great team at NatWest, and has been working across for the last 16 weeks. So Nick is going to go through the high-level findings of the report now. So over to you. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Shona. Lucy, can I have the slides, please?
Here we go.
Just waiting for the slides to arrive. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. Morning, everybody, and once again, sort of welcome to this session. What I wanted to do really was to take you through the high-level findings from 16 weeks of research that we've carried out across the north of England in collaboration with our DMOs. And so you can see we worked with 9 DMO partners across the north. So first of all, thank you to all of those partners who participated in making this happen, and also gave access to their businesses and encouraged their businesses to participate. Over the 16 weeks, over 200 businesses were involved in submitting fortnightly data into the survey and into the Barometer. So we've got a really good sense of performance both across the north of England, but also at a micro level across DMOs. And we've been sharing the findings of each wave with DMOs and those participating businesses. And as Richard has said, really, the findings have been really helpful in getting to understand the impacts, the challenges, and the opportunities that the sector was facing and has and continues to face. We've been able to share those findings so that businesses have been able to barometer themselves and to sense check their performance with their peers and with the industry performance across their local area. But also, and possibly more importantly from our point of view, we've been able to feed this information into our local support mechanisms, so into the GMCA in Manchester, the Combined Authority, and politicians at a regional level, but also feeding this data through into the national bodies. So we've had a direct conversation with Visit England, Visit Britain, the Department for Media, Culture and Sport, and really fed these findings through so that policy changes have been based on the information that we've supplied, and really that's helped those people in making those decisions understand the needs of the sector on the ground. And I think that's been really vital in helping shape the sorts of recovery and the sorts of responses that government and local agencies have been able to put into place. I suppose where I start really is this: there has been a roller coaster. Richard alluded to it in his introduction, but what we saw over the 8 waves of a 16-week sort of survey really is a roller coaster ride. Where when we came out of lockdown at the beginning of July, there was actually a real uptick in people's ability to respond in certain parts of the region. But across the north, we saw that trading improved during that first period of July and August. By the time we got to September, there was certainly an improvement in people trading with revenues of over 75% down, and there was a big improvement on footfall into businesses across the north. But then we went into the period of the end of furlough and the second lockdown, and that performance was reversed really, where we saw a growing concern about footfall, a growing concern about revenue, and the sense that furlough was coming to an end, and that was going to have a real impact on reducing roles across the north, really. So, if I took you through some of the information below that, really. So the big thing around revenue is that businesses are continuing to carry a significant loss to revenue. We know that 31% of businesses reported a revenue loss of over 60%, even at the peak of their trading performance in late August, where things were a semblance of normality. There was still a significant amount of businesses trading with more than a 60% loss in their revenue, and that's really continued throughout the period and has got worse towards the end of the survey period. Businesses have had to make significant reductions to their permanent and temporary staff. From the end of September and throughout October, over half of businesses were reporting that they were downsizing their permanent staff over the next month. And really, in October, we saw the uptick in the expectation that temporary staff and casual staff were going to be laid off as a result of the end of furlough, and that played through as furlough came to an end before we started into that second lockdown. We asked about the business on the books, really, and at the end of October, 3/4 of businesses reported that business on the books until the end of the year was significantly down on the same period, and that was before the second lockdown was announced. And again, from the end of October, 2/3 of businesses were reporting that their Q4 bookings, that's the period between January and March, were significantly down on where they were. And there are some significant variances across the north, really, and I'll come on to talk about some of the nuances between different areas of the region in a moment. One of the big factors that is playing out in all of this at the moment is the lack of consumer confidence. And that is reflected in business confidence about when recovery might happen, really. So we've seen a real shift and a move to a further distance as to when business may come back to normal. At the start of the survey, there was an expectation from businesses that revenue would recover to pre-COVID levels by July of next year. By the end of the survey, so 8 weeks later, people were looking at revenue not recovering until January 2022, and consistently that's been the same both for rural businesses and for more urban businesses, where they're saying that the highest proportion of businesses making employment reductions don't see those employment levels coming back until January 22 at the earliest. There is continues to be and a growing, I suspect. You'll appreciate that this survey finished before the second lockdown started, but at the end of the survey, there was a concern that that businesses may not survive. We reported that 5% of businesses were concerned of being able to survive till the end of December, and that's pre-second lockdown, and a further 21% were concerned that they would not get through until next summer. These concerns are really based around financial losses and the reduction in demand, and is the same both in rural and urban destinations. And these concerns over business survival are reflected in another piece of research that have just come out in the last couple of days from ONS, which says that 34% of businesses in the accommodation and food service sector had low or no confidence in their ability to survive over the next 3 months. So business survival is a real concern going forward. And certainly will be one that we monitor closely as we come out of this lockdown period as to what happens next. If I go on to look at some of the local area challenges, then there's definitely been some nuances, and again, Richard alluded to those in his opening remarks, really, where we noticed that visitor footfall has been strongest in rural areas, and perhaps Jill, when she speaks later, will talk about the picture from Cumbria, but also across Cheshire, Lancashire, and the rural parts of County Durham. The visitor footfall has been higher than in the northern cities, where in Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, Gateshead, they've all seen significant falls in their usual visitor numbers. Interestingly, the rural areas have been strongest in revenue performance compared to business as usual. And Manchester and Liverpool and Newcastle, Gateshead have all had the largest proportion of businesses trading with a significant overall loss in revenue. So a real sort of rural city dichotomy there between the two areas. The cities have also seen the biggest proportion of businesses reporting reductions in the loss of permanent staff during the 4 months. And businesses in Liverpool and Manchester have seen a significant fall in business on the books for the final quarter. Interestingly, every business in Liverpool, in Leeds and Manchester reported a significant downfall in business on the books for January to March, and really that's a reflection of where their markets are coming from and where they rely on that business to come from. So some of the most important areas for driving business, conferences, events, those city experiences, I've seen no signs yet of opening, and that's reflected in the expectation of business on the books for the final quarter and where that business might return. If we look at that cut down of business concerns around survival, I think again there's a real sort of sense that the rural areas are more concerned about the short-term survival of their business, and perhaps that's a reflection of the more independent nature of those businesses, the more owner-occupied nature of those businesses compared to those city areas. But overall, as I say, the concern going forward is that how many of those will be able to cash flow the next 3 or 4 months as we continue in this current state, really. So what does the future look like? As I said right at the start, most businesses don't expect return to normality at least until 2022 and possibly beyond. There's an interesting dynamic around when different parts of the sector reopen. So larger business events, larger weddings, groups, education-based trips will all need to return to being able to be held before business can return from those markets. And other restrictions around opening hours, capacity, and customer group restrictions will all have an impact on their business ability to recover and to return to revenue and employment headcounts, really. I mentioned already the reliance by some destinations on conferences, on festivals, on concerts, on sporting fixtures to support footfall and business. And all of those things will need to see a change in the current restrictions before markets return, obviously, and business improves. Those businesses that rely on International markets are likely to have a longer journey back to recovery, as we know that international markets will be the slower to recover, and we're expecting domestic to recover first of all. But then vaccination, and again, there's been news this morning about vaccination, so that may indeed change timelines. And all of this thinking that came from businesses was before the current sort of news around vaccination announcements that have been made over the last few days. As we enter to 2020-21, if the local restrictions are still in place, then there will be impact for both the level of restrictions within those destinations, but also on the restrictions within the source market for those destinations. So we know that, for example, a tier 3 restriction in Greater Manchester has a real impact on Cumbria because of the source market that Cumbria takes from visitors travelling from Greater Manchester. So the restrictions are not about just what are in place locally, but where those markets come from for those destinations. And it's likely that destinations with higher restriction levels will face decreased consumer confidence as restrictions continue to hold. Obviously, those operating restrictions are likely to continue to have an impact on capacities and hours of service. I think that's where I'll stop, if I may, Shona. The slides were all available after today's event. Destinations and participating businesses have all received the fortnightly reports, so we'll be fully versed with a lot of that data. But other members and other partners on the call today may see those overviews of what's been happening in the marketplace and reflect on how that affects their own business. I think the big concern at the moment is where we end up at the end of next week, once we know a bit more clarity around the next stages of coming out of lockdown, and certainly the impact that will have on businesses in both city and rural destinations.
Thanks, Nick. That was really thorough. So we'll send those slides on to everyone after the presentation. Just a couple of questions that have come in. So one from Mark Mattison. Do we know if there's a survey, an equivalent survey that's been conducted by DMOs in the south of England? We don't know of any, but I'm just wondering, Philip, perhaps, do you know, in terms of from the NatWest side of things, is something being conducted, or perhaps Richard?
Richard, I haven't seen anything. I'm not sure whether you have from colleagues, but there are some aspects of this. You can find comparable measures in the national statistics when it comes to something like business turnover metrics, but there's not nearly so much detail normally available.
We did. Sorry, Richard. We did share the format of the survey with the National Coastal Academy and the Southwest Regional Tourism Alliance, and they used some of the format of the way that we were conducting the survey to conduct their own surveys. I haven't seen the results of those yet, but there may well be some similar comparative data elsewhere, given that we shared at a very early stage the approach that we were taking.
And I'm sure that, as you say, Philip, the comparable nature of this data will be valuable, so we can share it with the likes of DCMS, etc., going forward. And just another question from Rachel McQueen, who also participated in this survey from our perspective as a DMO in Lancashire. Rachel just asked, how can we break the data down by business, so by accommodation, extraction, etc.? So Nick, can you answer that one?
The raw data is there. We haven't done that analysis, and it's really a question of sort of cutting the data and the resources that we had to do it. So the raw data is there, but that analysis hasn't been done.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Nick. Now I'd like to pass over to Philip Bartlett, who's a senior economist with NatWest, who'll share some insights and forecasts. So over to Philip.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Nick. That's really, I guess, quite shocking, although perhaps not entirely surprising, sort of findings from this piece of work. So that's very interesting to sort of learn. I know there's been a huge amount of economic news flow recently. It feels like things are changing almost daily or almost by the hour sometimes. So I thought what it might be useful to do today is just to take a few minutes to summarize some of the key developments that we're seeing in the economy, obviously with a particular sort of northern hospitality tourist slant to them. So I thought first, if I try and answer the question, how will the economy evolve over the coming months, and then ask what are the developments that we should look out for as well. So just jumping straight into the first of those, how will the economy evolve? I think right now you could say the economy is like a bear and it's gone into hibernation for the winter. So take that image away with you today. I think the recovery that we've seen over the sort of the last 3-4 months has now gone away and is over until the springtime, unfortunately. And that's a shame because just a couple of weeks ago there was a lot of good economic news. We saw that the economy expanded by 15% in the third quarter, and that's really good. The downside is that most of that growth happened in the summer. It happened by and large in July, as the reopening from lockdown happened, and growth had slowed to just 1% in the month of September. And here in the north of England, the NatWest regional PMI shows that there's a real clear loss of momentum more recently as well. So in October, it looks like the pace of growth had basically ground to a halt in the northeast, the northwest, and Yorkshire and Humber as well. And that obviously coincides with the resurgence in COVID cases and the increased caution that brings among households and businesses, as well as the local lockdown measures that were in place in October as well. And clearly since then, we've had this, at least for me, a surprise announcement of the new national lockdown in England. That we think means that the economy is now set to shrink again in the fourth quarter of the year. So in the final 3 months of 2020, we're expecting the economy to contract by something like 2% overall. And actually quite weak growth we're looking for in the first 3 months of next year as well. We don't think the economy will be able to grow more than about 2% in the first 3 months of next year, because post-lockdown, we are expecting measures to be relaxed in December, but not to the extent that they were previously. So what that means, I think, fast forward 6 months from here, and I think what we're looking at is that the level of GDP overall, the size of the economy, is probably going to be no change from where we are currently. And that's a big deal, because currently the economy overall is 9% smaller than it was at the start of the year. That's huge. That's a deeper recession than at the worst point in the financial crisis or any of the sort of preceding recessions that led up to that. And I think worse for people on this call, this is really an antisocial recession. What I mean by that is that it's those sectors that are reliant on face-to-face contact that are really feeling the pain from this. And I don't need to tell you, but I mentioned the economy overall, 9% smaller. If you look at the hospitality sector, so food and accommodation, if you look at leisure services, if you look at travel and tour agents, they're all a quarter smaller than they were at the size of the year in terms of the value added, the output from those industries. And that's just unprecedented sort of pain, really. And the latest indicators are that things are going in the wrong direction in November, unsurprisingly, I guess, given that lockdown. But a couple of stats, hospitality footfall in Manchester and Liverpool last weekend was 85% down on its level of last year. And we know that restaurant bookings too are around about 90% below what they are normally. We also see just I've become very adept over the last few months at following some high frequency indicators. We just see that people are not traveling around the country in the way that they would normally, with obviously huge consequences. So rail passenger volumes are down by 3/4 now on their pre-COVID levels and going in the wrong direction. We've seen a sharp drop in car usage in November, which is now at its lowest since June, when obviously we were only just emerging from lockdown. And domestic flights, flight numbers are down by about half, but passenger numbers are down way in excess of that. I think it's about 80%. And alongside these sort of developments, we've seen some really tectonic shifts in economic activity in the space of just a few months as well. So just to name a couple of these, we've seen people go from spending on services to spending on goods. So overall, household spending has largely recovered to its pre-COVID levels, but whereas retail sales, so people buying stuff, physical things, are actually quite an impressive 6% above their pre-COVID levels, We've got spending on hospitality services, leisure services, way down, perhaps 40% lower than normal. We've also seen a big shift from buying things physically to digital. Obviously, the obvious one there is the kind of rise of online shopping, which is now taking up 30p in every pound of sales, sort of brought forward about 5 years worth of growth there. And this kind of point as well came out a bit in Nick's presentation. I think we've seen a shift from cities, particularly larger cities, towards towns and perhaps slightly more rural areas in terms of where activity is happening. I think that relates quite closely to the working from home trend we've seen as well. So currently 44% of us are working from home, which is close to the April peak. That's about 4 times the level that we had in a normal period last year. And it's likely that some of these trends, I think, are going to outlast the pandemic as well. So just quickly, what should we look for in the months ahead? I think definitely the rollout of the vaccine is the key thing to watch for. Try and ignore the news on the discovery or proof of vaccine. That doesn't matter so much as actually getting it to the population. It is a huge challenge to get it to more than half of the population to reach that level of immunity. But when that happens, or when that's on course to happen, that is going to be a game changer, and that will drive the recovery in the economy overall. The timing and the strength of the recovery very much depends on that. I mentioned that we think growth in 2021, first few months, is going to be weak. We think actually probably it will for the entire year, because it's just such a challenge to reach the whole population. I don't want to be too pessimistic there, but I note that actually the timing of the recovery from the survey respondents was sooner than we think it's going to happen. But I guess that's encouraging. It's nice to see businesses sort of hopeful there, and that certainly does align with the likes of the Bank of England, who are forecasting more of a V-shaped recovery. Mm-hmm. I would also watch out for what comes next for government policy support. We know that's been pretty key, a big lifeline in a number of different areas. In particular, will the Chancellor be persuaded to continue that reduced rate of VAT post-April? We note that firms haven't really passed on the savings to customers. Instead, it's been just supporting them. So that really is quite critical, I think, for the tourist industry. Secondly, what's the future of the furlough scheme? It is going to continue to march, but what are the employer contributions going to be? At what pace will they rise? And what comes next after March to avoid a cliff edge? I think the recent past is probably quite a good guide to the Treasury thinking on that, and they'll probably go down the same route as they were starting to this autumn. But again, watch this space. What are those terms and conditions? And then obviously, I don't want to get into it, but Brexit, what's going to happen in the next week or so on Brexit? That's going to matter a lot for the tourist sector. So lastly, I would just say watch out for general changes in the mood music. And by that I mean, what's the general kind of feeling out there in your customer base and amongst the public? Because I think when the recovery does come, perhaps it will come more quickly than a lot of people are anticipating. Currently, we've got very depressed levels of consumer confidence. I think that relates to people worrying about losing their jobs. We've got record levels of redundancies at the moment, and unemployment is now rising quite quickly. But because we've not been able to go out as much as we normally have, households have saved a lot of money this year, sort of enforced savings. Actually, it's worth 7.5% of the entire size of the economy in extra savings in the bank. And that's especially the case among people who are slightly better off, slightly higher income levels, and slightly older in the population as well. I'm not sure what the profile of your business is, but I would actually say perhaps those are people who are more likely to be visiting places domestically. And I think people may well start to spend some of that money and really drive a kind of a pickup in activity once they feel that the worst is behind them. It's hard to kind of be confident about the outlook at the moment, given the uncertainty, and when there's the sort of prospect of future job losses in the spring of next year, sort of after the furlough scheme. But as soon as people start to think that we're through the worst of it, I think that we could see that recovery start to come along. So I'm going to end it there, and thank you for bearing with me. But hopefully there will be a bit of time later on for some questions and some discussion as well.
Great, thanks very much, Philip, for that very pessimistic summary of the current situation.
I'm sorry.
I did. You're doing your job really well there. In terms of some really good stats and trends. I think in terms of the positives, retail spend a bit up, 7.5% extra savings. That would indicate that there's a pent up demand for taking holidays in the future and taking leisure. So that's something to be optimistic about. So thank you for all of that. As I said before, we're going to have questions at the end, so please ask your questions. I'm going to ask all of the panelists a question each, but if you'd like to ask any of yours, and the question I'm going to ask is that if there's one thing that we could ask the tourism minister, we've got a meeting with him coming up on the 3rd of December, what would it be to support businesses in the next, in the imminent future? So if you can bear that in mind and then add it in your questions, that would be really helpful. So we're joined by two of our DMO colleagues today. We couldn't get all eight on this call this morning. So Jill Haig, who's Chief Executive at Cumbria Tourism, and Chris Brown, who's at Marketing Liverpool. And they're going to give a perspective across the city region, their city regions and their regions of the whole of the north. So if we start with Jill and then move on to Chris, and then we can take questions in the Q&A afterwards. So starting with Jill. Welcome, Jill. Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much, Sharon, and thanks to everybody who's been involved in what I think has been a really valuable project. I'm obviously going to give the rural perspective, which is clearly very, very different to what's been happening in the city regions. But I think the overall pattern is similar. So for us, the appeal, the sort of proposition of a rural place, the idea of it being safe and outdoors and people having space to roam, meant that actually, even when the restrictions for travel were lifted, before lockdown itself was lifted, we saw large volumes, and that in itself created a challenge for rural communities in terms of opening up and managing that when businesses were closed. And then when the people started to come, they're quite a different visitor profile to those that we've had in the past, which is something that we need to manage, but is also an opportunity for us in the future. And there was a really high demand in terms of accommodation, but of course accommodation provision, because of capacities, was reduced, additionally with attractions. And what we'll be able to predict last year, the year before, was very, very different. So people were much more cautious about indoor attractions, a lot more in terms of people choosing to eat at home before they eat out to help out. So a lot of orders and deliveries to self-catering accommodation, for example. So what we did see was a real drop in terms of visitor spend. But having said that, I think, like Nick alluded to before, July, August and September largely were probably better than businesses could have hoped for at the start of all of this. And our businesses were really preparing hard for an extended season. And so a lot of, for example, the camping and caravan sites that would normally close at the end of October were going to stay open right through. But then, of course, we saw the impact of the restrictions that were happening. Nick very helpfully explained that even though most of Cumbria was Tier 1, we felt that immediate drop-off in terms of visitor support. So, and the corresponding drop in terms of confidence. Interestingly, for us, we've been conducting, in parallel to this, a tracker survey of Cumbria tourism businesses. So we've had about 900 responses. And it's pretty in depth, but honestly, it's so parallel with these NatWest Barometer findings. It's quite uncanny in some ways. They're so consistent. But what we're really seeing is that the number of visitors, the value of the visitor economy and employment are all down now. This is hot off the press today, by over 60%. And about 70% are planning redundancies. Sorry, 70% are planning reductions, and about a third are planning redundancies. And I think it's that confidence, that lack of knowing where we're going and what's going to happen. Us as consumers lacking in that confidence, that's the challenge. And for an economy like Cumbria, where the rural economy, the visitor economy is so critical. Half of our jobs in the Lake District National Park are tourism, and we did have the unenviable title of furlough capital. So I'm not going to say too much more, but I do want to just talk about a couple of points of optimism. I think that as destination management organisations in the NatWest, we've worked well together. We have lots to take forward together. I think our businesses we had a big session yesterday. Our businesses have learned lots from this that can be positive that we can take forwards. And I think that, there's a lot for us to tap into in the future. What we need to do is support our businesses to be able to get to that future.
Great, thanks, Jill. So over to Chris.
Yes, good morning. Good morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think from a Liverpool perspective, obviously there's a lot of similarities to Manchester and other big cities. And I'll probably look at this in kind of three ways. I think from the initial problems that were created for the pandemic starting in March, devastating effects to our visitor economy. For Liverpool, 48% of our business rates, which represent £270 million a year, is paid by businesses in the hospitality, tourism and cultural sector. So it's you don't have to do the maths too far to understand what damage that has. And what really in effect happened is that, and has happened, is all our natural demand drivers that drive people to come to a city, energy, vibrancy, being together, business events, going to watch the football, couldn't even go and watch the league champions. Yeah, I had to get that.
How are you, Chris?
All those drivers, nighttime economy, all basically switched off overnight, and that for cities are their lifebloods, and also that has an impact into the wider city region. No doubt that the suburbs, the rural and countryside areas of the city region have prospered better during this period, but still they rely heavily on outflow coming from people who spend additional time when they come to a city and move out from that city and go elsewhere. And additionally, we lost all our cruise line business, so we had 108 port of calls for Liverpool this year, our record number for cruise liners, and we ended up doing 0. Interestingly enough, we have 107 booked for next year. Now, I don't know whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist on that one to see whether we'll actually end up with that number next year, but we'll see. I think then when we came into July, August, when we came into out of the lockdown, I saw a kind of surge in confidence, and I also saw a surge in quicker and more rapid decision making. So in Liverpool, we quickly adapted to the opportunity to provide outdoor licenses for pavement licenses for businesses. We awarded 200 of those inside 4 weeks. We shut two roads in the city centre. We made decisions that we'd probably prevaricated around for about 5 or 6 years. So I think actually there are a number of things coming out of this that actually I think out of a crisis will make us look better and form out better going forward. But that confidence then was basically began to be sapped away. It was sapped away initially by tier 2, and then of course we went into tier 3. And I think within the context of tier 3, the two things that really damaged us more than anything was the 10 o'clock curfew and also the rule of 6. The rule of 6 probably having the greater impact. And that basically restrained the ability for businesses to actually operate within COVID safety guidelines. And what I would say, and I think it's important for this conversation, is that businesses have gone beyond, I think, in many ways, to provide safe environments for their consumers. They've really invested heavily in that. They've really taken on board the messages. And it's really been a problem in terms of that confidence and into consumers to basically come out and enjoy those businesses, because actually I think there's a better experience in many ways to be had in a business than there is in your home, in one respect, where you're more likely to spread COVID. So I think there's a kind of lot of work that the businesses have done there that maybe hasn't been as well recognised nationally as it should have been within the sector. I think now where we are, Liverpool, as you know, is a mass testing pilot at the moment. And that I think has been very interesting, not only for Liverpool, but also for the country, in terms of the fact of demonstrating that a lot of asymptomatic aren't carrying the virus, less than 2% in Liverpool. So that is providing what I think is the whole essence of this, which is providing confidence and hope that we may be able to break out of this opportunity. We want to take that testing now into the event sector to be able to actually demonstrate that we can get auditoria filled, not on COVID safety guidelines, but also by proving that actually we can get a negative proven audience into those places, which will allow us to do more people and therefore make it commercially viable for those businesses to do that. So the outlook for us, I think, going forward, December the 3rd is really important in terms of what happens. I think if we are able to get some days of trading in, but it will be very interesting to see what government do with that. I hope that they adopt some of the changes like Wales did with the curfew, and allowed a bit more flexibility around that 10 o'clock. That will allow bars and restaurants to do two sittings rather than one, and allowed our bars and allow a more comfortable dispersal after 10 o'clock at night. The furlough, I think they've made a mess of furlough, to be brutally honest. They should have done it a lot earlier. We lost a lot of jobs, which are unnecessary. Yeah. But basically, that furlough needs to continue. And if there's anything the government that I've come to learn is that they do everything in the short term. And what we need is a medium to long-term strategy well beyond April. This is going to take a long time for this sector to recover. I think going back to what Philip was saying around the VAT, to me, that has to stay all year next year. I don't think, I think that these sort of incentives are required to give confidence to the businesses. And I think the first 6 to 9 months of next year are going to be troublesome. They're going to be difficult because our businesses haven't been able to plan for events. So anything we've got, those demand drivers won't be switched on, I think, until the vaccine begins to take impact. But in conclusion, I would say that the work done by you guys at Marketing Manchester and through NatWest in terms of this barometer does run very parallel to what we've been doing in our own city, and it's been a great piece of work. And I hope it can continue going forward, because I think it does provide valuable insights and opportunities to look at what the North is doing, not just our own city.
Thanks, Chris, Jill. I think between us all, we've given a good reflection on right across the 9 DMOs, what the experience there. And I think I'll take that question in terms of government asks, I think, of the Tourism Minister. A couple of questions then that have come in. So I think it's Ian Thomas has asked, do any of the panel have any views on how we think the latest lockdown and possible extensions of restrictions come on the 3rd of December will have on the comprehensive spending review and potential support for the sector? So the spending review, believe the announcement will be on the 26th of November, and it's going to be kind of 1 year. So would any of the panelists like to take that question? Richard? Would you like to give you?
So talk about impossible questions. Yeah. I have no insight whatsoever as to what the Chancellor's going to say in his spending review, and I suspect he rewrites his whatever he might say daily at the moment. Whether Philip's got any inside knowledge, I'm not sure.
No, I mean, you would hope that there is not too much right now. I think we're going to see some dire forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility, both in terms of the economy over the next couple of years, but also the state of the public finances. And you would hope that calm heads prevail within the Treasury and that there's no attempt to try and repair those holes right now by talking too much about raising taxes or cutting spending. I've seen some rumours about freezing public sector pay from next year, and it just feels far too early to do that. And actually, my kind of ask of the Tourism Minister and the Chancellor overall would probably be to keep those spending taps on for as long as possible until we're well into recovery, in order to shore up the demand that's out there. So yes, that's not a lot of insight into what is definitely going to be in the spending review, but I think it will be not just on the spending side. There'll be some talk of future tax as well, and let's hope that let's hope austerity doesn't reappear too quickly, and that tax rises are not on the menu for any time soon either.
Thanks, Philip. And Jill?
It's not specifically on the comprehensive spending review, but I think Joan and Nick and Chris, in the conversations that we've been having with DCMS and the Tourism Minister, what they're very clear about is that one of the side effects, if you like, of this last 8 to 10 months has been how pivotal the visitor economy, tourism, hospitality has become in central government. There was a quote, I won't attribute it to anybody, but there was a quote about how pre this, they had to go knocking on everybody else's doors, whereas actually everyone's knocking on DCMS's door at the moment. And I think that's something that we can hold on to and use to amplify our message going forward.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing, it's definitely been highlighted in terms of the tourism sector as a whole. It's recognised it's not one product, it's quite a diverse sector, quite hard to understand. So I think there's more understanding about the sector, and definitely more profile because the spotlight's been on it. And when we don't have it, the effects on our communities, towns, cities is really impacted. So I think that's a good thing. And so what we're trying to work with the DCMS and the Tourism Minister's team is to build on that, build on how do we actually create that message about the impact of the sector and what it needs going forward. Another question came in from Mike Kelly. We don't really know the government's attitudes in terms of what's going to happen for the next lockdown. I believe on the 20th, we will know what the lockdown and the new tier structure will include. And from that then follows the series of provisions of any changes to grants. But can any of the panelists answer in terms of, will the government's business interruption loan scheme have no cut-off date? Anyone get any insight to that? I personally wouldn't. Any other thoughts?
So the business interruption loan schemes are run to the end of March at this point in time. I've no idea whether they're likely to be extended. There are ongoing discussions as to what ongoing support there might be, but I don't know what it will look like at this point in time.
No, I think maybe if we have another discussion after the lockdown and the new tier system, which I believe is going to be quite fluid. So we will keep in touch with you, Mike, on that one. So the question really for all the speakers before we leave today is that, we'll be with the Tourism Minister on the 3rd of December. What is the one significant question, or what's the priority or the ask of support to help businesses within the tourism, hospitality and leisure sector? What's the one question you'd like to leave with the Minister? So if we start then in order of where we came in, perhaps, Nick, if you could go first.
Right. Well, we have 10 asks of government.
You're only one.
We've set those out very clearly in our discussions with DCMS and with our own MPs here in Greater Manchester. So there are a range of asks, but I think there are two that I'd like to just highlight. The first is continuity of the support packages in place at the moment, and I think so as we come out of this current situation, some continuity around those. I think Phil mentioned those already, and the second one, and I suppose this is my top ranking one, and sorry to be greedy, it's really about that longer term plan, really, and some stability around being able to plan. I think the one thing that came out of the business barometer is the concern that people don't know what's going to happen next, and I think businesses need some sense of being able to plan for what happens next month and the month after that, rather than on a daily or even over the weekend they have to change their plans. So I think that longer term planning and a sense of a plan being in place by government would be my priority ask.
Okay, thanks, Nick. I'll let you go having two questions. Richard, what would be your question or your thoughts?
Okay, so where I sat in front of the Minister, I think the first thing I would say, I would acknowledge that the challenges government faces, and probably tell him he's done a good job before moving on to my ask, which would be, it would be almost the same as Phil's just talked about. I think it's some degree of certainty, both short term and longer term. We businesses are faced with cliff edges, be it with support around funding, be it with support around employment. I think in the short term, Christmas, what is going to happen over Christmas would be the first thing you want some clarity around. And then longer term, what is the replacement for furlough, and what is the possible extension of government support for financing of these sectors? Because short-term repayment of all the debt that's being taken on is not going to be possible.
Thanks, Richard. Philip, anything to add to that?
Oh, I'm lucky because I get to make a second point, don't I? Yeah, so I think this is a great piece of work, and I would use this to try and demonstrate just how difficult it's been for the sector overall, and to make that very clear. And based on that, to ask for continuation and ask what are the plans for continuing the support and the grants to businesses that are going to get them through the next 6 months or so. If we're going to be living with a system of tiered restrictions, and it looks likely that we are for some time yet, then I think we've, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think we've done a great job of lending this time around through the crisis, and I think we've probably reached the limits, or we are close to reaching the limits of what that can do to get businesses through this. So how are government going to make sure that there it's a pragmatic system of grant funding for businesses that are affected, whose capacity is constrained, or who are required to stay closed because of these? And we've already heard that this isn't necessarily just in the areas that have got tiered restrictions, it can be in the neighbouring areas as well. So just what are the plans for making that happen?
Thanks, Philip. Jill? Sorry, Chris. Best till last.
So if people hadn't gone before me, I would have talked about cash flow and that ability to plan ahead. As Chris alluded to before, the sort of backwards and forwards thing with the furlough scheme has been so damaging. It's great that it's there now, but my goodness, you know, what could we have saved had it been had we had that continuity earlier? I think I'd like to give a bit of a shout out for some of the parts of the sector that haven't had the level of support. So the supply chain, some of the companies limited by guarantee, we're dealing with some absolutely heartbreaking stories, are such a critical part of our recovery. So for me, it would be, let's look and see what we can do to support that particular part of the industry.
Thanks, Jill. And Chris?
Yeah. I mean, all the good ideas have been nicked before me, of course. But no, I mean, I think fundamentally would be a recognition of the ecosystem of which is all connected. That, you know, this is not about culture versus hospitality versus tourism versus events. You take one brick out the wall starts to crumble. And I would hope in the medium to long term they recognise that actually this is about joining up this ecosystem much more effectively than has been the case running into COVID. Would be my first point. Within that, I think would be this urgent need for you know, recognising, as I guess Jill's just said there, that, you know, elements of this sector have not even had a chance to kick a ball since March, and they need much more support during the course of 21 in order for them to rebuild their business, get jobs back on the market, and you know, if at least if we get that as a recognition of the need for that, then that will be a big step forward. Because you know, I'm very similar to Jill in that respect. You know, I deal with a lot of businesses that are basically brilliant businesses. It's not their fault they're in the mess that they're now in, and they need support to help them rebuild what are great businesses.
Lovely, thanks, Chris. I think my one would be to add definitely a plan for business visits and events, because we are the only country not to have a plan to help them get out of this mess. I think talked to some EU colleagues and convention bureaus, and I think they're just a way ahead. So that would be my ask. And there's plenty of others coming in. So Rachel, Leslie and Gary, thank you for your suggestions as well. We'll make sure we put them forward to the Tourism Minister. So that's up to me now to wrap up. Thank you so much for all attending. Thanks to our speakers, Richard, Nick, Philip, Jill and Chris this morning. And thanks to all of the 9 DMOs who participated in this survey. As always, we'd like to have your feedback. So there's a poll, just a really quick, are you likely to attend a future event based on this event today? And we will be sending the slides out later today. So thank you all for attending, and keep safe and well. Thank you.